Frontline is a presentation of the Documentary Consortium.
Tonight on Frontline, the story of how Matsushita, the largest consumer electronics firm in the world, conquered the American television industry. One of Japan's leading thinkers, the writer and social critic Shuichi Kato, investigates Japanese corporate culture.
It's a paradox how the Japanese can take over a company the Americans have thrown away and in a short time make it profitable.
Here in Los Angeles, as our numbers here grow, we begin to make an enclosed community, an easy target of American resentment.
It's almost like we have rushed into marriage, economic marriage, yet we're now beginning to wake up and say to the person whom we've married, who are you?
Yeah.
And
Tonight on Frontline, coming from Japan.
With funding provided by the financial support of viewers like you, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is Frontline.
The first time I met an American was a month after the bombing of Hiroshima. I was a doctor at the Tokyo University Clinic. One day, an American officer came to visit. He asked me to fly with him to Hiroshima as part of a U.S.-Japan medical team. It may seem strange when I tell you that at that time, I felt little anger toward the Americans. My greatest anger was at my own leaders, if not the Japanese people who had followed them so blindly. The Americans defeated us and liberated us. In crushing our military, they gave us back the meaning of our lives. Looking back, it is clear I underestimated one central fact. I was part of a defeated country. The dynamic between victor and vanquished had been set, and it would resurface. This is now my 10th trip to the United States, spanning 30 years, and the tension between the two countries has always been there, though not as overt and as visible as today. Today there is bitterness everywhere. Japan's new wealth seems to pose a crisis of identity for Americans, who are hard-pressed to grasp a world in which they may not be number one. But Japan's great strength has also created a crisis for the Japanese, and this I believe is not so well understood. Our wealth has brought us all over the world, and wherever we go, we find ourselves in collision with our own culture. This, in the broadest sense, is the subject of this film. I was in America at Frontline's invitation to look at one great Japanese company in the United States. The film would be a collaboration. Frontline would investigate, and I would bring my perspective as a Japanese writer. Ours would be a case study of Japan's troubled expansion to the outside world.
The deal announced today is one for the record books. More than $6 billion is how much the Japanese electronics giant Matsushita will pay to take over MCA, the parent company of
the conglomerate that owns Universal Studios, is being sold to Japan's giant Matsushita Electrical Industrial Company for more than $6 billion.
The Universal Studios tour.
It captured America's attention for a single day.
And today, some American tourists were a little worried about that.
The largest acquisition ever by a Japanese company. For many Americans, this was the first time they had ever heard of Matsushita. But with its brand names Panasonic and National, This company is, in fact, the 12th largest in the world, and it has a tangled and bitter history in the United States, reaching back many years. Konosuke Matsushita, founder of the Matsushita Electric Company, at the end of World War II. With his company and his country in ruins, Matsushita made an unlikely promise. Japan would again be a power among nations, he said, this time through peaceful means. The world was entering the age of electronics. Japan would be a leader in this field.
The first time Matsushita went to America was, I believe, around 1950. It was a shock for him. He was seeing America in its golden age. He set out to achieve that kind of prosperity for Japan.
To understand Japan, you must know it is a tiny string of islands with almost no natural resources. To thrive in a modern world, we must export. But for centuries, Japan had almost no contact with the outside world. We need the outside world, yet it has been largely alien to us.
もともと松下幸之助は
Konosuke Matsushita was a simple man from the country. The needs of the American people were a mystery to him.
欲するか
He thought about what he should make. He considered televisions. The U.S. dealers concurred.
Matsushita set his sights on the U.S. TV market. Some 20 years later, most of the U.S. television industry had disappeared. Matsushita would be embroiled in legal investigations, and his company would be the largest manufacturer of televisions in the free world.
The big change, complete restyling. The big change, no knobs, dials, or gadgets. The big change, new high and easy tuning.
It seems hard to recall, but 30 years ago, the United States dominated the markets for television sets.
About the big change in RCA Victor television history.
All across the world, companies like RCA, GE, and Zenith were considered the most competitive. Japan's market was closed to foreign companies. Unable to sell their own sets in Japan, RCA and GE licensed their technology to Japanese manufacturers, including Matsushita. Frontline's investigation reaches back to 1956. In that year, and again in 1964, Kei Matsushita helped to organize a cartel that included Sanyo, Toshiba, Hitachi, and Sharp. This cartel's history is known in Japan, but it is mostly Americans who will speak about it publicly.
We know that the Japanese television industry organized what we in this country would call a cartel as early as 1956. And they were setting prices for the Japanese market. They were setting the discounts that the retailers would be permitted to earn. They were setting the discounts that the wholesalers would be permitted to earn. They had a fix on the market.
By setting artificially high prices for television and other appliances in Japan, the companies could generate high profits. They could then use these profits earned at home to undercut foreign competitors abroad. This kind of price fixing was illegal in America and in Japan.
In 1956 and again in the early 60s, the Japanese equivalent of our Federal Trade Commission, which was really established by U.S. authorities after the war, twice charged the Japanese industry with unlawful cartel action. In both instances, the Japanese industry, in effect, pleaded nolo contendere, didn't really deny the charges.
The cartel may have had the tacit support of the Japanese government, But the manufacturers had to hide their double pricing system from U.S. authorities. They did this through a plan that required the collusion of U.S. dealers, such as Alexander's and Sears.
極めて順調に販売が伸びましてですね。
Sales proceeded very smoothly.
その松下幸之助という人は
Matsushita the man is still today considered the god of sales.
アメリカの
He took very good care of the important dealers in America.
This is how the plan worked. When Japanese manufacturers sent a television through customs, they would declare an official price, high enough so that the U.S. Customs would not investigate. The manufacturers would then offer a secret refund to the U.S. retailer, often through a Swiss bank account. The U.S. dealers proved enthusiastic. This is the face of Japanese corporations that strikes fear in Americans. 1962. Matsushita Company celebrates its first shipments of the year. Secretly, the Japanese manufacturers were exporting their goods at prices far lower than in Japan, and perhaps below their cost of manufacture. Japan's television industry expanded rapidly.
The effect of trying to compete with this dumping of Japanese television receivers at very low prices in the United States was to force the American television manufacturers, including companies like General Electric, GT, Sylvania, Ford Motor Company that owned Philco, Magnavox, to the wall. And one after another, they either went through bankruptcy or they were acquired by foreign competitors.
This price fixing cannot on its own explain one country's failure or another's success. It is obvious other economic factors were at play. The Matsushita Company refused to be interviewed about its history. But the cartel founded by Kei Matsushita met until at least 1977, by which time nearly 90% of the U.S. industry was gone. Konosuke Matsushita was perhaps the most respected industrialist in Japan, revered as a moral authority. How could he be seen so differently outside our shores? And why did he devote himself to this plan? One of the themes of Japanese life has been a moral double standard. We protect those within our family or group, and we are often indifferent to those outside it. In our society, even the Japanese can be outsiders, but the ultimate outsider is the foreigner. Kei Matsushita believed that business would restore Japan, transform our country into a paradise on earth. But for business to prosper, he and his country needed the outside world. How the rest of the world would fit into Japan's revival, this has never been clear. America insists on seeing the world in its own image. Your worldview, in its own way, has been as insular as Japan's. Perhaps it is your religious past, but America is one of the last countries still to believe in a holy war. You find energy and purpose when you have an enemy. And today some Americans would like Japan to fill that role. But had America been attentive, Matsushita and other Japanese manufacturers could not have harmed the U.S. industry as they did. In the 60s and 70s, this country seemed so vast and rich it could afford to be careless with its future. Japan was all but ignored. America's heart and mind were elsewhere, consumed by the Cold War, the holy war of its day.
Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and his wife toured Japan's industrial heart in Osaka. A view of mass production in the new Japan is provided by one of the largest producers of radio and television sets. This welcome by school children is sharply in contrast with the communists who tried to inflame industrial workers against the Attorney General. But Mr. Kennedy shrugs off minor leftist hostilities and calls the Japanese the friendliest people he knows.
When Japanese companies took aim at the U.S. television market, they faced, in many ways, an easy target. U.S. companies had been drawing large profits from the television business. When challenged, many firms simply gave up the field in favor of short-term profits elsewhere. In this way, they abandoned not just television, but related fields such as video recorders and semiconductors for years, even decades to come. As for the U.S. government, I think its actions were negligent. Frontline investigated.
If you've been waiting to buy color TV, the color TV you've been waiting for is here. Zenith Perfected Color TV.
The television dispute became public in 1968 when U.S. producers charged the Japanese with dumping goods at illegal prices. After a 3-year inquiry, the Treasury Department ruled the Japanese had been dumping. At the time, no penalties were assessed.
I joined Zenith as president in the spring of 1971. It was a matter of a month or so after the United States government had come down with a dumping finding with respect to Japanese television sets. And I sort of, at that point in time, discounted the Japanese threat. I thought it was resolved by the dumping finding.
As Japanese televisions poured into the U.S., the estimated duties climbed to tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. The government collected $1 million in 1972. Then, all collections stopped for 6 years. At about this time, Japanese housewives met with the Matsushita company. Japan's consumers had learned how cheap Matsushita televisions were in the U.S. and had come to protest high prices at home. Too often this is overlooked. For a company to sell goods at artificially low prices in one country, it must typically overcharge in another. Japanese consumers and U.S. producers were on the same side of this battle, but if U.S. policymakers understood, they showed no sign. In 1972, Prime Minister Tanaka requested a 1-year delay in all trade disputes. President Nixon agreed.
Mr. Prime Minister, may we always meet as we meet today, working for the great goals of peace in the Pacific and peace in the world.
America remained absorbed by the Cold War. Japan's only importance was as an instrument of that policy. And so the two countries moved to an unspoken agreement. One I believe was corrupt and harmful to both sides. Japan would unfailingly support U.S. foreign policy. In return, the U.S. would overlook our transgressions in trade.
The government of the United States' position, I think, in the simplest terms, when it looked at the television trade dispute, was that it was an annoyance. It was a problem that ought to be swept under the rug. It was not a problem that the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, or the Carter administration was willing to confront at the price of an argument with the Japanese government.
In 1977, a new man took charge of trade, Robert Strauss. There are now 6 U.S. television manufacturers, compared to 25 when the U.S. industry filed its complaint. Yet according to Frontline's inquiry, no more dumping duties had been collected, and no reasons given. The U.S. Customs estimated that nearly $400 million was owed, and they sought to collect. The Treasury Department overruled them. Furious, the customs officials took their story to an American journalist.
The customs agents, they're cops. And they thought the boys on top in Treasury were fixing the case, that's all, throwing the case. It's as simple as that, good old police talk. They were just convinced that they were being undercut, to use a fancy word, sabotaged, to use a more direct word, and they smelled a rat.
Unknown to the customs agents, Robert Strauss had reached a secret agreement with the Japanese government. Publicly, Japan put a limit on future television exports. In return, Strauss wrote a secret letter assuring that the Justice Department would not press charges on unfair pricing, that other investigations would be curbed, and that the Treasury Department would, quote, resolve promptly the dumping charges.
What happened is that the ability of customs to enforce the law properly was undercut through pressures from the Treasury Department and indirectly through pressures from other parts of the government.
The American government and much of the U.S. industry seemed always several steps behind. By the time this case was settled, it was 1980. Frontline estimates the government collected perhaps 10% of what was owed, but even this is not the point. For by 1980, this dispute was irrelevant. The American industry was mostly gone, and Matsushita, like other Japanese companies, had seen the writing on the wall. Trade tensions were too high. Matsushita had to move to America. I was in my 30s when I first traveled out of Japan. I remember the shock of the West, the outspokenness, the assertion of strong individual style. This was foreign to me, and it took me a long time to grow used to it. I'm sorry Matsushita did not allow me to meet their Japanese managers here. I would have liked to compare my experience with theirs. Perhaps I had an easier time. I came to do medical research and also to write, and I came on my own. But managers arrive as a group. Japanese society is built on the idea of loyalty to the group. And so managers must focus inward on their fellow Japanese, even while living abroad. It's important to remember they are not free. Theirs is a divided and precarious position.
There was a young man that was from Japan that truly wasn't the old traditional Japanese, a real conservative guy. He was single. At that time I was single, and we became friends, and he happened to play tennis, so we played tennis, and we got to know each other quite well. Then all of a sudden, he disappeared. I don't mean from the company, but I mean from our get-togethers Friday night over at the bowling alley. And I finally called him up one time, and I said, "What happened? We haven't seen you for quite a while." And he says, "Well, I was kind of told that I'm becoming too American." And I said, "Well, isn't part of your game plan here to learn about us?" And he says, "Yes, but only to a certain extent." So the rules for Japanese were also very, very strict and could not be broken. And when they crossed the line, they were reprimanded.
The Quasar facility, bought by Matsushita in 1974, its very first acquisition outside Japan.
Well, when I first joined Quasar, I went there because I knew they had a good marketing department. And I knew it was just purchased recently by the Japanese. So the quality and the manufacturing ought to be improving quite a bit. And so just looking down the road, to me, it was a place to be in electronics. Good marketing with good product and good reliability, that's the place to be. What the Japanese did to reliability is just unbelievable. I mean, they took a product line that had required high repair rate and made it almost a product that repairs were just not required at all.
松下にとってみれば、なぜモトローラでさえ採算に合わないような。
Why was Matsushita able to make this company productive and profitable when Motorola could not?
自信があったようなことなんですね。僕よくアメリカ人にも日本人も言うんですけれども、これある意味じゃジャパニーズパラドックスだよ。
They consider this the Japanese paradox. How can the Japanese take a corporation that Americans have thrown away as unprofitable? The Japanese buy it and within a short term, turn it around within 6 months or a year, take over and bring it up to profitability. It's something like a miracle.
Welcome to the Matsushita Corporation. We have now reached the main production portable radio factory. This is just one of our 20 main assembly plants.
Japan's management methods had begun to attract attention worldwide. Kei Matsushita and his company were considered the guiding spirits of this management style. But now that it had bought Quasar, Matsushita faced a new and unfamiliar problem. It would have to practice his corporate philosophy with managers who were not Japanese.
松下がですね、現地で生産をするというのは初めての体験だったということ。
It was Matsushita's first experience in production overseas. The Matsushita philosophy was based on the Yamato spirit, the Japanese national spirit. He tried to apply this to the American management as well, and it was completely, flatly rejected. The Yamato spirit, it means the Japanese nationalist spirit, unity against foreign enemies and self-protection at all costs. Konosuke Matsushita applied this spirit to his management philosophy.
This was at the beginning when I first joined Quasar, and it was a cafeteria line, and I'd get my tray, and you could sit anywhere. And I automatically sat down with the Japanese because I thought it'd be a good opportunity to learn more about the Japanese, etc. And I did this for a couple of times, and I didn't see any problem with it until one of my cohorts told me that maybe it might be a good idea that if during lunch that I ate with the Americans instead of the Japanese. And I asked, why? He said, well, we're discussing the things that relate to Japan. And I said, aren't I part of it? He said, no.
Within America, the American companies, there are really two organizations. There's the Japanese organization, and then there's the American organization. In some companies, in fact, in some parts of Matsushita, I saw complete separation. The Japanese had their own organization, the Americans had theirs, and they virtually didn't communicate with each other. They had their own little cultures and their own little thing going, and you could walk across the hall, for example, and it was just as though it was a different company.
Well, we would be in a meeting, say it's a product development meeting, and deciding which models are going to be introduced at what time, and I'd be presenting a plan of why I thought this ought to be happening at this time, this ought to happen at this time, and they'd be maybe 4 Americans and 4 Japanese in the meeting. And after I'd present my position, many of the times all of a sudden the conversation all turned to Japanese. And then they'd be discussing back and forth in Japanese what I assume what I had just talked about.
日本式な経営一つ類型化するとすれば、行員さんだとか一般社員には喜ばれる。
The Japanese management system is loved and adored by the average employee, but not by the engineers, the managers, the professional level, people who like to have responsibility handed over to them.
人には非常に嫌われるやり。そうすると、その間では当然アメリカ人マネージャー、エンジニア。
You're going to have all kinds of opposition here, problems, confrontations. The Americans felt excluded from the decision-making process, felt that the Japanese monopolized it.
almost every significant managerial position had a co-manager, co-Japanese manager, kind of making sure that they could relate back to Japan what was going on, what was being decided, how it was being decided, and putting in their comments and giving direction. Although they were co-managers, they were really separate and independent personnel structures, so to speak. I had my boss, and my co-manager had his boss. They weren't the same boss. We had different grade levels, different salary structures, different chains of command, totally.
The Americans play what I would call a support role. They are advisors, they are staff specialists, they are marketing geniuses, they are sales experts. But when you're talking about power, talking about who runs the company, I think that has to do with who owns this place. And in Matsushita, you know who owns the company and who runs it. And it's the Japanese. And they're very clear about that.
We were not, how to put it, part of the family. And I would really say that with a little bit of emotion, because a number of us really tried to become part of the family, really learn the rules of the game so we could operate within the format. But I feel it was Japan's goals to make sure we didn't know the rules of the games so that we could not become part of the family. And so that we would make those obvious mistakes and we would be constantly kept outside.
To function overseas, Japanese companies need foreign managers, but to include them within the group carries risk. The company may fear losing the discipline that has brought it so much success. Perfection is Japan's enduring national value. More important than religion or ideology, perfection to us is almost an aesthetic sense, deep in our culture and hard for other countries to imitate. This artisan tradition of perfectionism has been very useful in the making of cars, or VCRs.
One has to get a feeling of the whole manufacturing environment. When you walked the production line, and if you can picture 50 or 60 people in a row putting a little part in and passing a part down, that when a group of people were ushered into this environment, that no one looked up. At every line, the lines basically competed against each other for quality, for zero defect. So there's a tremendous pride instilled in the factory environment that they're part of a whole mechanism, part of the wheel.
Matsushita's strengths and its weaknesses are in many ways the same. Like other great Japanese companies, Matsushita has tapped into the conformity and anxieties of the Japanese worker and mobilized these into a vast group effort. Village life and extended family have vanished from our culture, and the company has taken their place. This group spirit, the source of Matsushita's insularity, is part of his great industrial strength.
A well-run company, well-managed, and always looking after the best interest of the company on a long-term view. Interestingly enough, and many Americans have taken this as a humorous attribute, but Matsushita actually has a 250-year plan. There's a serious attempt on the part of top management to view the company as a very long-term entity.
In the 1980s, Matsushita's fortunes were tied to a single product, one that would make them far richer and more powerful than they had ever been.
VCR のあれってのはマイクロチップスと同じように今日米いろんな競争の一つ。
The VCR, like the microchip, is a symbol of some of the battles between the United States and Japan. Ampex had been selling it at the time for $100,000. It was a huge, ungainly piece of equipment.
Panasonic introduces the world's lightest, smallest VHS video recorder.
They just simply don't give up. And if they once have determined they're going to enter this market or that market, they just say, we'll keep trying, redesigning the product, revising it, and improving it.
They are a real machine when it comes to making things. In one case, a VCR factory in Washington State that I visited, they were able to throw up the factory and get the production line moving in 4 months. It's staggering how fast they can move.
Matsushita at one point was producing 2/3 of all VCRs worldwide. An American shopping for VCR might have looked at GE, RCA, Sylvania, Magnavox, Montgomery Ward, Quasar, or Panasonic, and have no idea all were Matsushita made.
Call me irresponsible. 今までのロボットには難しかったデリケートな作業。
Matsushita had proved itself one of the greatest manufacturers of all time.
卵の反動トルクを指の圧力センサーが正確に読み取り、加える力を微妙に調節するのです。
At the end of World War II, this company had been near collapse. The Japanese had looked to America to revive their companies, their economy. Now, the tables were turned.
It's a great day in Elgin, beautiful weather, and we're having a groundbreaking for Matsushita. They're building a new facility here in Elgin, something alike that we haven't seen.
It's a very credible company and really means good economic things for the Elgin area.
Today, Americans are competing for Japanese investment, hoping to lift their economy and improve their living standards that have been stagnant for 20 years. The U.S. is ambivalent. Even as it clamors for this investment, it also resents it. One can sense wounded nationalism in the air. European money pours into the U.S. unnoticed. Japan's causes an uproar. Is this racism? Perhaps. There is certainly fear of the outsider. But there is also a belief among Americans that they have not been served well by Japanese business. If there has been fear, there has also been disappointment.
When we threw open the gates in the mid-'80s to a flood of Japanese investment, we had certain assumptions about how it would be. We thought that there would be all these ripple effects, the so-called multiplier effect of a plant. It would ripple through our whole supplier base, and the revenue would be tremendous, and that the technology transfer would be significant. And we thought that these investments would be a part of a revitalization of the American competitiveness. But we didn't do a very good job in spelling out what we wanted the rules to be. We didn't spell that out because we assumed that they would do it the same way we would do it.
Americans like to think capitalism the world over is run American style. This is not always true. Coming from Japan, our corporations have brought with them their own ways and their own long-standing relationships. At the time of this filming, this young manager is preparing to fly to America. He is being drawn by the bonds that tie one Japanese company to another.
Take care of yourself and work steadily for the country. I pray for you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
For many years, this small company, Matsui, has been a supplier to giant multinationals in Japan, including Matsushita. These ties will now continue in the new country. When large Japanese companies move abroad, studies have found they will typically use suppliers they know from their home country, even when it is more expensive to do so. The close ties between Japanese companies can make for a separate society. They are in the United States, but not fully part of it.
The host country does not get the same kind of benefits that they would have expected. The trade imbalance with Japan doesn't disappear in the same way because the unit is still buying from back home.
At times, Americans have been slow to recognize this problem. Consider, for example, Quasar.
As you know, in order to increase our production quantity,
This is the weekly management meeting of a manufacturing plant in the suburbs of Chicago. The plant is owned by Matsushita, the Japanese electronics and home appliances giant, but most of its top management is American, including its president, Richard Kraft. Matsushita bought the failing plant from Motorola and turned it around.
Bud, we have a little report from production.
Quasar's success was celebrated in the American media. But Frontline found that Quasar was being gradually hollowed out from the inside. The parent company soon began shipping equipment and parts from Japan.
Quasar was a company that manufactured nothing. We were a sales company. We were a distribution organization. Who did we buy from? We didn't have the luxury to go out in the marketplace and say, well, let's see who can we buy from this week. Who has the best price on the market? We were forced or obliged, if you may, to buy from Matsushita, the manufacturing organization.
Of course, what they did is they began shipping their own guts, so to speak, or the chassis from Japan and putting them into cabinets or turning Franklin Park or what was left here into pretty much a final assembly operation.
You can depend on Quasar.
Johnny's on television.
It's just beautifully red.
Publicly, Quasar was an American television, not subject to import duties or quotas.
Inside the TV set, there was no doubt that the entire product was Japanese, or Japanese sourced.
I suppose if you look at the net effect of of a Matsushita taking over a Motorola and moving in the direction that they did, is you lose technical skills, you lose,
you lose tax income, you lose jobs.
'Cause what they did is they began shipping their own guts, so to speak, or the chassis from Japan and moving in the direction that they did is you lose technical skills, you lose tax income, you lose jobs.
'Cause what they did is they began shipping their own guts, so to speak, or the chassis from Japan and moving in the direction that they did is you lose technical skills, you lose
Shortly after buying Quasar, Matsushita shut down 2 plants in Illinois. Later, Quasar's American research and engineering staff was phased out. The next phase took place in 1986. The television industry was in recession.
Well, in March of '86, Quasar sent me to Japan to go to director school. And on that trip, I came back with the new head Japanese guy for Quasar. And when we came back, rumors kind of milled around that he had had previous experience where significant layoffs had taken place. Then in early May, 60 days later, one evening, I heard something's coming down tomorrow.
The Matsushita company had pioneered the system of lifetime employment. It is proud that in its 70 years, it has never laid off a Japanese employee.
Came in the next morning, and all of a sudden I kept hearing, this guy just got it, this guy just got it, this guy just got it, this guy just got it. Then my phone rang about 10 o'clock. It was personnel, so I'm walking down the hall knowing what's going to happen. And went into the office, and basically he said to me, I guess you've heard what's happening. I just want you to know it's going to affect you. Well, I'd kind of prepared myself for this walking down the hall, so it's no big deal. It's got to happen. It's got to happen. Let's go on through life and go find another job and keep going. No big deal. But what really affected me and just hit me with a ton of bricks is I said to him, well, what kind of time frame are we talking about here? He said, we'd like to have your desk cleaned out by noon.
My response when I heard about that reduction in force was, I don't believe that they could have let the few key people that could really save Quasar, could continue its existence, that those are the ones let go. My first question was, how many Japanese left? Because I knew the answer, and the answer was none.
Well, if you took all the employees of Quasar and listed all the Americans in one column and all the Japanese in the other column, all the people that, quote, got it that day all came out of the American column. As simple as that.
It would come as no surprise to Americans that a lawsuit followed, and it tells a story. 3/4 of the American managers were let go, while the Japanese were kept. The American managers who remained had their salaries frozen. The Japanese managers received wage increases. This grim cultural divide had slipped into public view. In April of 1989, the employees of Matsushita mourned the death of their founder. He had been a standard bearer for Japan's revival.
Mr. Matsushita was an inspiration to people around the world. He urged Japan to take its place as a full member of world society and to help others achieve the prosperity that Japanese worked so hard to attain. We will miss him, but his spirit will always be with us. My best wishes to all your family at this time of sadness. Sincerely, George Bush.
Many feel the changing of the generations will solve Japan's problems with the outside world. The old guard is passing, it is said. The young will prove more worldly. I do not believe so. For some years, this company has tried to change. Its slogan is Kokuseka, internationalization. Its leaders know they must join the rest of the world. But for the Japanese employees, the large companies are the passport to a life, the exclusive source of income and friends for their adult years. Under these circumstances, you cannot afford to be an outsider. The sole Matsushita executive we were allowed to meet was pessimistic about internationalizing the company's culture. How long would it take, we asked. He said, 100 years.
To foster the benefit of mankind through electronics technology. To make the company philosophy of human electronics a reality, Matsushita Electric has brought many innovative products to the world in the field of semiconductors, basic materials, computer science.
Today, the Matsushita company makes products all over America. Cathode ray tubes in Ohio, workstations in Colorado, electronic pagers in Georgia, in-flight communications in California. Controversy seems to have followed. There was price fixing of VCRs, dumping of electric typewriters. In the courts, there were charges of patent infringement for television cameras and optical discs.
It's almost like we have rushed into marriage, economic marriage, which we have, so deeply interpenetrated, yet we're now beginning to wake up and say to the person whom we've married, who are you? Yeah. And exactly. We're in this very, very awkward situation, and I want you to change. And you say to me, I want you to change. It's not going to happen really that way. So this inevitably there are going to be strains.
Here in Los Angeles, you can feel how fully these two economies are married. In the past 3 years, Sony has bought Columbia, and Matsushita has bought MCA Universal, to name just two purchases among many. Entire shopping centers serve the Japanese community. As our numbers here grow, we begin to make an enclosed community, an easy target of American resentment. The Thousand Cranes restaurant in downtown Los Angeles is all too easy for Americans to despise us, just as 20 years ago, rich Americans abroad were despised. But the men here are no one's enemy. If you were to listen in, what you would hear might surprise you. Late in the evening, you may hear jokes about superiors, weary sarcasm about the companies for whom such men work. Managers have surrendered their time and their lives to their companies, and privately, many feel anguished about it. This is what Americans have not understood. The walls of Japanese corporate life that shut you out, shut us in. The power of Japanese corporations is a problem for Americans, and for us as well. More than any other institution, the corporation enforces our national conformity. As the great companies gain power, there is less choice in Japanese life. When I fly home, I prepare to re-enter a society where freedom is found only at the margins. I am going to a country where there is little room for the outsider, whether foreign or Japanese. Can this change? Only if individuals will stand up to the group and stake a claim against conformity. This, I believe, is the central crisis of Japanese life. If we can confront it, then perhaps we will have less conflict as we encounter the outside world.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.